The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which Eleanor Voss would later think was a cruel joke from the universe, because Wednesdays were supposed to be ordinary. She had been standing in the narrow hallway of the Ashworth townhouse, holding a tray of morning tea for Lady Ashworth, when the butler, Mr. Graves, had stepped in front of her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not quite pity. It was something colder than pity. It was the face of a man who was glad the bad news belonged to someone else. "Lady Ashworth will see you in the drawing room," he said. "Leave the tray." Eleanor set the tray down on the side table beside the hall mirror. She caught a glimpse of herself as she passed. Plain brown hair pinned back neatly, gray dress pressed smooth, collar straight. She looked, as she always looked, like someone who had prepared carefully for the day. She had no idea the day was already finished. Lady Ashworth was standing near the fireplace when Eleanor entered. She was a tall woman, narrow in the way that suggested she had always been careful about what she allowed herself to enjoy. Her dark hair was piled high, and her rings caught the firelight as she turned. She did not offer Eleanor a seat. That was the first signal, though Eleanor, still believing the world operated on fairness, did not read it correctly. "I will be direct," Lady Ashworth said. "My pearl brooch is missing, the one my late mother gave me. It was in my dressing room 2 days ago, and it is not there now." Eleanor waited. "I am sorry to hear that, my lady. Would you like me to help look for it?" "That will not be necessary." Lady Ashworth's voice had a precise, clipped quality to it, like scissors cutting through silk. "I have already looked. My maid has already looked. And I have been told that you were seen entering my dressing room on Monday afternoon." The room went very still. "I went in to return your gray shawl," Eleanor said carefully. "Mrs. Fowler asked me to put it on the chair near your vanity table. She was occupied with the laundry." "Yes," Lady Ashworth said. "That is convenient." Eleanor understood then. She understood in the way a person understands when the floor shifts beneath them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly. The ground was no longer where it had been. "My lady," she said, and she kept her voice even because she had been raised to keep her voice even. "I did not take your brooch. I have never taken anything from this house. I have worked here for 3 years, and in that time I have been trusted with your daughter's education, your correspondence, your household schedule, and every room in this building. I am not interested in what you would or would not do," Lady Ashworth said. "I am interested in the fact that the brooch is gone and you were in the room. That is sufficient for me." "It is not sufficient for truth," Eleanor said. The silence that followed was dangerous. Eleanor knew it was dangerous. But she was 26 years old and she had worked honestly since she was 17, and she was not willing to bend herself into the shape of a confession for a crime she had not committed. She stood straight. She kept her hands at her sides. She held Lady Ashworth's gaze without flinching. Lady Ashworth's expression did not change, but something behind it hardened into a decision. "You will collect your things and leave before noon," she said. "I will not be providing a reference. You may consider yourself fortunate that I am not involving the constable." Eleanor left the drawing room. She walked up the stairs to the small room on the 3rd floor that had been hers for 3 years, the room with the narrow window that looked out over the back garden, where she had graded papers and written lesson plans and read books by lamplight until she was too tired to keep her eyes open. She took her 2 dresses, her 3 books, her mother's cameo brooch, the only piece of jewelry she owned, and her savings, which she kept in a small tin box beneath a loose floorboard, because she had always believed in the wisdom of that particular habit. She did not cry. Not yet. She was on the street by 11 o'clock, with a small bag over one arm, and the November wind cutting through her coat like it had no interest in her warmth. London smelled of coal smoke and damp stone, and the sky was the color of old pewter, flat and low and indifferent. Eleanor Voss stood on the pavement outside the Ashworth townhouse and made a decision. She would go to the employment agency on Cavendish Street, the one that had placed her with Lady Ashworth 3 years ago, and she would explain the situation and she would find another position. She was qualified. She had references from the 2 positions before Ashworth. She spoke French and could read Latin. She knew music theory and basic arithmetic and could teach geography from memory. There was no reason, she told herself, that this would not be manageable. It was not manageable. The woman at the Cavendish Street agency, a Mrs. Plimpton with round spectacles and a manner that suggested she had heard every story twice, listened to Eleanor with her pen hovering over her ledger. Then she set the pen down. "Lady Ashworth has already been in contact with us," Mrs. Plimpton said. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "She contacted you this morning?" "Last evening, actually. She anticipated you might come here." Mrs. Plimpton's voice was not unkind, exactly. It was the voice of someone delivering weather news. Unfortunate, but not personal. I am afraid there is nothing I can do. Lady Ashworth is one of our most valued clients. Her word carries a great deal of weight with the families we serve. Her word is wrong, Eleanor said. That may be so, Mrs. Plimpton said. But I cannot place you on the strength of your word against hers. I hope you understand. Eleanor understood. She thanked Mrs. Plimpton, which was either very dignified or very foolish, and she walked back out into the cold. Over the next 11 days, she visited 4 more agencies. 2 of them turned her away before she had finished speaking. One of them listened politely and then sent her a note the following morning that said simply, "We regret that we have no suitable positions at this time," which was a polite way of saying they had spoken to Lady Ashworth, or someone who had spoken to Lady Ashworth. The 4th agency was run by a small bird-like woman named Mrs. Hayward, who had not yet heard the story and who seemed genuinely interested in Eleanor's qualifications, until she stepped into the back office for 10 minutes, and came back with a different expression on her face. Someone had telephoned. Eleanor did not ask who. She found a cheap room in a boarding house on Garrett Street, run by a landlady named Mrs. Quill, who had 3 rules. No gentlemen callers, no cooking in the rooms, and the rent was due every Friday without exception. The room was small and cold and smelled faintly of cabbage, and the wallpaper had a pattern of brown flowers that Eleanor's tired eyes kept trying to make into faces. She paid 2 weeks in advance from her savings and told herself she would have a position before the 2 weeks were up. She did not. She wrote letters. She wrote careful, precisely worded letters to families she had heard of through other governesses. Families who were perhaps new to London and might not yet have connections to the Ashworth circle. 2 letters came back, politely declined. 4 did not come back at all. 1 came back with a sharp note informing her that they had been warned about her character and did not appreciate being contacted. Warned. The word sat in Eleanor's chest like a stone. She began to understand the scale of what had been done to her. Lady Ashworth had not simply dismissed her. She had systematically closed every door, whether out of malice or self-protection or some combination of both. The woman had decided that Eleanor Voss should not work in any house where Lady Ashworth's opinion carried weight. And Lady Ashworth's opinion, it turned out, carried weight nearly everywhere. Eleanor counted her money on the 14th day. She had enough for 3 more weeks of rent. Then there would be nothing. She was not a woman who panicked. She had been raised by a father who believed that panic wasted energy needed for thinking, and the habit had stayed with her. So she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and she thought about what she had. She had her education, she had her physical health, though the cold and the lack of proper meals were beginning to wear at the edges of it. She had her honesty, which had proven somewhat inconvenient. And she had a deep, stubborn refusal to become someone who gave up. She thought about what she could do. She could take in laundry, but her hands were not suited to it and she had no equipment. She could work in a shop, perhaps, though most shops wanted experience she did not have. She could try the smaller agencies outside central London, though traveling cost money. She could write to her only remaining relative, a distant cousin in Dorset whom she had not seen in 11 years, and who had never much liked her even when they had been children together. But that felt like a kind of defeat she was not yet ready for. On the 15th day she woke up and found that she was hungry, in a way that was different from ordinary hunger. It was the kind of hunger that had been building slowly, quietly, because she had been eating less each day, without quite acknowledging she was doing it. She had been making a loaf of bread last 4 days. She had been choosing between eating in the evening or having something in the morning, and choosing the morning because mornings required more energy for job searching, which meant by the evenings she was hollow and tired and cold. She put on her coat. She had one more lead to follow, a family in Marylebone whose advertisement she had found in a 3-day-old newspaper. She would go there directly, without an agency, and she would ask to speak to the mistress of the house and she would make her case clearly and calmly, and without anything that could be mistaken for desperation, even though desperation was becoming the truest thing she felt. It was raining. It had been raining since before dawn, the kind of rain that was not dramatic, no thunder, no lightning, just steady and cold and relentless, soaking through her coat by the time she had walked 4 streets. She had no cab fare to spare. She found the house in Marylebone. She knocked. A housemaid answered and told her that the family had already engaged a governess the previous week. The advertisement had simply not been taken out of the paper. Eleanor thanked her and turned away. She walked. She was not sure for how long or in which direction, exactly. The rain was heavier now, and the streets blurred at the edges. She had not eaten since early morning. A heel of bread, nothing more. And the cold had moved from her skin to somewhere deeper, into her bones, into the place where her determination usually lived. She turned a corner onto a wide street lined with tall white townhouses, the kind with polished brass on the doors, and flower boxes empty for the winter. She kept walking. And then, without theater or warning or any of the drama she would have written into the scene had she been telling it as a story, her legs simply stopped working properly. They went soft beneath her, not all at once, but progressively, like a table whose legs were being quietly removed. She reached for the iron railing beside her and caught it, and held on, and stood there for a moment with the rain falling on her face and her breath coming short and sharp. She was not a woman who fainted. She had always been quietly proud of that. But the world was tilting, and the railing was cold in her hand, and she thought, with a clarity that seemed strange for the situation, I am not well. This is not the kind of not well that goes away with a glass of water. This is something more serious than that. She held the railing. She breathed. She tried to straighten herself. And then the door behind the railing opened, and a man's voice said, sharply and without warmth, "What is happening here?" Eleanor turned her head. The door belonged to one of the tall white townhouses. The man standing in it was very tall himself, dark-haired, and dressed in a charcoal coat that looked like it had cost more than 3 months of her former salary. He had the kind of face that was not quite handsome but was striking, all strong angles, a jaw that suggested someone who had learned to hold himself very still, and eyes that were dark and watchful and, at this particular moment, deeply suspicious. She gathered what remained of her composure. "I beg your pardon," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "I was passing. I am perfectly well." She then, in direct contradiction of this statement, sat down on his front step because her legs had decided the performance was over. She heard him call for someone. She heard bootsteps on the stone. She heard a woman's voice, older, practical, saying something about the rain, something about bringing her inside. Eleanor wanted to say that this was not necessary, that she was quite capable of standing up in a moment, that she was not the sort of person who required rescuing from other people's front steps. What she said instead was nothing, because the world had gone a quiet shade of dark, and she was extremely tired, and the stone step was, at least, no longer moving. The last thing she registered, before everything went properly dark, was that someone had put a coat around her shoulders. A very warm coat, an expensive coat by the feel of it, and that small warmth, that single small thing, was enough to make her cry, silently and invisibly, in the dark behind her closed eyes. She had held herself together for 15 days. She had been turned away from 5 agencies. She had eaten bread for a week. She had stood in the rain. She had been called a thief by a woman who had never in her life needed to be careful about what she took, because everything had always been available to be taken. And now some stranger had put a coat around her shoulders. It undid her more completely than any of the other things had. She let herself be carried inside. She did not have the strength to resist it, and some quiet part of her, a part that had been surviving alone for a very long time, recognized that perhaps, just for this one moment, it was all right to be held up by something other than her own stubbornness. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, in the entrance hall of a townhouse she had never been in before, belonging to a man whose name she did not yet know, Eleanor Voss breathed carefully and slowly, and was, for the first time in 15 days, warm. She woke up on a sofa. It was a very good sofa, the kind that belonged to rooms where people did not need to worry about the cost of things. The fabric was deep green and smooth, and there were cushions that had been placed with enough deliberateness to suggest someone had arranged them carefully. A fire was burning in the grate across the room, and its warmth reached her from a pleasant distance, not too close, not too far, the way warmth feels when you have been genuinely cold for long enough to know the difference. Eleanor lay still for a moment and took stock of herself the way her father had taught her to, starting with what she knew for certain and working outward. She was alive. She was indoors. She was warm. Her coat had been replaced by a heavy wool blanket that smelled of lavender and cedar. Someone had removed her wet shoes and placed them near the fire to dry. She still had all her belongings. Her small bag was on the floor nearby. She sat up slowly. Her head swam for a moment, then steadied. The room was a study or a sitting room. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a large desk near the window, a painting of a landscape above the fireplace that had the confidence of something genuinely valuable. The rain was still falling outside, blurring the glass. The fire crackled. Everything was quiet. The door opened. The woman who came in was about 60, with gray hair pulled severely back and the bearing of someone who had run large households for a long time and knew it. She carried a tray with a cup of broth and a plate of bread, and she moved with the efficiency of a person who did not waste steps. "Good," she said briskly, settling the tray on the low table near the sofa. "You are awake. Drink the broth while it is hot. All of it, please. You look as though you have not eaten properly in some days." Eleanor accepted the cup. The broth was warm and salted and tasted extraordinary, which told her more about her current state than she wished to admit. "Thank you," she said. "I am sorry for the trouble. I will not impose on your household for long." "No trouble," the woman said, though her tone suggested she would be the judge of that. "I am Mrs. Pruitt. I run this house." "Eleanor Voss," Eleanor said. Mrs. Pruitt gave her a look that lasted precisely 2 seconds longer than a polite look usually does. "The master would like a word with you when you are well enough, if that is agreeable." "Of course." Eleanor drank the broth. She ate the bread. She did it without rushing and without the self-consciousness of someone being watched, because she had learned long ago that accepting help gracefully was as important as offering it gracefully. Afterwards, she felt measurably more like herself, still tired, still cold at the edges, but present. "I am ready," she told Mrs. Pruitt. She was brought to a room farther down the hall, a larger room, clearly used as a main study, with a fire going there too, and a window overlooking the rain-soaked street. The man she had seen in the doorway was standing near the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned as Mrs. Pruitt withdrew and closed the door. He was exactly as tall as she had registered from the front step. Up close, in proper light, he was perhaps 34 or 35, with the kind of controlled stillness about him that Eleanor associated with people who had learned to govern their expressions carefully. His dark eyes took in her appearance with a quick, thorough assessment that was not rude but was unmistakably evaluative. A man who had spent time judging situations rapidly. "Miss Voss," he said. He had a low, even voice. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you. I am sorry for the disruption to your household." "You did not disrupt it." He moved to the chair behind the desk and sat, which was either deliberate or simply practical, and gestured toward the chair across from him. Eleanor sat. "I am Sebastian Harrow," he said. "The Duke of Blackmere." Eleanor absorbed this without changing her expression. A duke. She had worked in titled households before, though not one quite so senior in rank. "Your Grace," she said. He waved that off with a slight movement of one hand. "I would like to know what happened. Mrs. Pruitt informs me you were in a significant state of exhaustion when you arrived at my step. You are not dressed for poverty, which suggests this is a recent condition rather than a permanent one. I am curious about the circumstances, if you are willing to share them." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. He had a direct way of speaking that she found she did not mind. There was no performance in it, no pretense of concern that was actually something else. He seemed to be asking because he genuinely wanted to know, and she was a good enough reader of people to trust that distinction. So she told him. Not the way she had told the agency women, carefully and tactfully and with all the sharp edges smoothed down to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. She told him plainly, the way she would have told her father, Lady Ashworth, the brooch. The accusation she had not been given a real chance to refute. The agencies, the letters, the boarding house, the bread. She did not offer opinions about Lady Ashworth's character. She presented facts. She watched his face as she spoke, and his expression did not shift much, but she caught the slight tightening of his jaw when she described Mrs. Plimpton saying that Lady Ashworth had contacted the agency the evening before Eleanor had even been dismissed. When she finished, there was a silence. "You have references from before the Ashworth position?" he asked. "2. Both in good standing. I can provide them." He nodded. Then he was quiet again, and Eleanor, who was good at reading silences, understood that he was thinking seriously rather than performing thought. She waited. Sebastian Harrow had not planned for this conversation. He had planned for a brief inquiry, a coin passed to a woman in difficulty, and the satisfaction of having behaved decently. He had not planned to sit across from someone who spoke with this particular quality of directness, the kind that came not from boldness but from simple exhaustion with pretending. He had not planned to find her interesting. He found her interesting. He picked up a pen from his desk, which was a habit of his when thinking. He needed something in his hands. "I have 3 sons," he said. It was not what Eleanor had expected him to say. "Their names are Edmund, James, and Theodore. Edmund is 13. James is 9. Theodore is 5. Their mother, my wife, died 4 years ago." He set the pen down. "I have employed a total of 5 governesses since then. 3 of them left because my sons made the position untenable. 1 left for personal reasons unrelated to the household. And 1, he paused, was asked to leave because she had very firm ideas about what my youngest son needed to do, and very little patience for the speed at which he was able to do it." Eleanor held herself very still. "Theodore has not spoken since his mother died," Sebastian said. There was no emotion in his voice as he said it. The absence of emotion was more telling than its presence would have been. It was the flatness of someone who had said the sentence so many times. to doctors and relatives and concerned friends, that he had stripped all feeling from the words to protect himself from them. The doctors have found no physical cause. He understands everything that is said to him. He simply does not speak. He is not, as far as anyone can determine, unhappy. He eats well, sleeps well, responds to questions with gestures or in writing, now that Edmund has taught him his letters. He simply does not use his voice. I understand, Eleanor said. Edmund is self-sufficient to a degree that concerns me more than it reassures me, Sebastian continued. He is an exceptionally intelligent boy who has spent the past 4 years managing his own needs quietly, because he observed early on that everyone in this household was occupied with managing other things. He is not unfriendly. He is simply contained in a way that boys of 13 should not be. He stopped. And James? Eleanor asked. Sebastian looked at her. Something in her face, her directness, her careful attention, prompted him to say more than he had said to the previous 5 candidates, all of whom he had told about the boys in the language of a man describing difficulties that needed solving. James is angry, he said simply. He was 6 when his mother died, and he has been angry ever since, and I do not entirely blame him. He breaks things. Not often, but when he does, he breaks them thoroughly. He lies, when he thinks it will protect him from something, and he runs, out across the grounds at the estate, across the moor, as far as he can go. He has been found twice by the head groundskeeper a very long way from the house at night. He did not say what Eleanor heard underneath that James's anger was not something Sebastian knew how to meet, that the boy's running frightened his father in a way that could not be entirely separated from guilt. Where do you live? Eleanor asked. Here in London? Primarily at Blackmere Hall in Yorkshire. I come to London for parliamentary sessions and for business. We will be returning to Yorkshire within the fortnight. He looked at her steadily. I am telling you this because I would like to offer you a position. Eleanor had half expected it, after the detail with which he had described the boys, and yet hearing it stated directly, still produced a small, sharp sensation behind her ribs that she would not have been able to label precisely. Relief and wariness in equal measure, threaded with something more complicated. As governess? She asked. As caretaker and educator. The title matters less to me than the function. I need someone to be present with my sons consistently, to teach them, yes, but more than that, to be a stable presence in their lives. The rotation of governesses has not been good for them. He met her eyes, particularly Theodore. I see, Eleanor said. I should be clear about certain things, Sebastian said, and his tone shifted slightly, still even, still direct, but with a precision that told her he had thought about what he was going to say before he said it. This is a professional position. I am not looking for someone to fill any other role in this household. My children's welfare is my priority, and I expect it to be yours if you accept. I am not an easy man to work for, I am told, because I have specific expectations about how things are done, and I express them plainly when they are not met. However, I pay well. I do not change the terms of employment without fair notice, and I respect competence when I see it. He paused. I also believe you did not take Lady Ashworth's brooch, he said. It was not something she had expected him to say, and she did not immediately respond. I have met Lady Ashworth at several social functions. She is a woman who builds her sense of safety by controlling the people around her. I do not think she believes you took it, necessarily. I think you said something in that drawing room that unsettled her, and this is the form her response took. Eleanor thought about the moment she had said, "It is not sufficient for truth." She thought about Lady Ashworth's eyes in that instant, not certain, not righteous, but something harder and more defensive than either of those. Perhaps, Eleanor said. The salary is £45 per year. You will have your own room, your meals, Sundays free from noon, and 2 weeks holiday in summer. He looked at her. Do you have questions? Eleanor had many questions. She asked the one that mattered most. What do your sons think about having a new caretaker? Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Edmund will test you. James will resist you. Theodore will watch you very carefully, and you will not know what he thinks for some time. He paused. But it was Theodore who reached out toward you when Mrs. Pruitt brought you into the house. He followed her all the way to the sitting room door, and he put his hand out toward you while you were on the sofa. His voice did not change. He has not reached out toward anyone in 2 years. Eleanor sat with that information for a moment. It settled over her differently than she expected, not as professional data, not as something to file and categorize, but as something that landed in the part of her chest where she kept the things that mattered. A 5-year-old boy who had not used his voice since he was 1, who did not reach for people, who had watched and waited quietly for 2 years, had reached for her while she was unconscious on a green sofa. I accept the position, she said. Sebastian nodded. Good. He rose, which indicated the meeting was concluded. Mrs. Pruitt will arrange a room for you here tonight, and a proper meal. We can discuss the specifics of the role tomorrow when you are rested. Eleanor stood as well. Thank you, Your Grace. He moved to the door to show her out. He paused with his hand on the frame. You said you spoke to Lady Ashworth plainly in the drawing room, he said. What did you say to her? Eleanor considered whether to tell him. She decided honesty had served her well enough. I told her that her accusation was not sufficient for truth, she said. She did not like it. Sebastian Harrow looked at her for a moment, and for the first time since she had met him, something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, it was the movement of someone who had been completely still for a very long time, and had come, for just an instant, close to something different. No, he said. I expect she did not. He left. Eleanor stood in the hallway, and breathed. She looked down at her hands, which were still slightly cold despite the warmth of the house, and she thought that she had arrived on this street because her legs had given out in the rain, because she had been too cold and too hungry, and too tired to walk another block. In any other direction, she would have collapsed on someone else's step, or no step at all. She would have sat down on the wet pavement outside a baker's shop, perhaps, and eventually been helped by strangers who had not wanted her, and would not have offered her £45 a year and a room and Sunday afternoons. She was not, typically, a woman who believed in luck. She believed in work, and in preparation, and in the habits that kept disaster at a manageable distance. But standing in the hallway of Sebastian Harrow's London townhouse, with the rain still audible outside, and the smell of someone's dinner beginning to drift down the corridor, she allowed herself one moment of something that could only be called gratitude. Vast, unguarded, slightly overwhelming gratitude, before she folded it away, straightened her spine, and followed Mrs. Pruitt to her room. She had a position, she had work to do, and tomorrow she would begin. The coach to Yorkshire left at first light on a Thursday, and by the time the city fell behind them, and the land opened up into its wide, pale winter flatness, Eleanor had reorganized herself into someone ready for what came next. She sat across from Mrs. Pruitt, who was efficient company. She said useful things when she spoke and was quiet when she had nothing to say, a quality Eleanor respected deeply. Between them, on the bench seat, sat 3 small valises belonging to the Harrow boys, one large leather case with a broken strap that had been repaired twice, one battered brown bag with a name written on it in childish letters, and one that was very small and had a drawing of what might have been a horse painted on the side in blue ink. Eleanor did not ask about the drawings. She looked at them and then looked out the window. Sebastian Harrow rode ahead with his manservant. He had appeared at the coach at 6:30 in the morning, confirmed the arrangements with Mrs. Pruitt in 3 sentences, given Eleanor a brief nod, not unfriendly, simply focused, and mounted his horse without further conversation. Eleanor had found that she did not mind this. She had worked for people who spoke constantly and meant nothing with any of it. Silence from a person who spoke carefully was more comfortable than noise from one who did not. The boys were already at Blackmere Hall. Mrs. Pruitt explained this during the first hour of the journey. They had been brought up to Yorkshire a week earlier by the previous housekeeper's assistant, and they had been in the care of the kitchen staff and the groundskeeper's wife since then. The staff are fond of them, Mrs. Pruitt said, in a tone that suggested she found the staff's fondness somewhat excessive, particularly of Master Theodore. He has a way of sitting very quietly near people until they feel compelled to feed him biscuits. Eleanor smiled at this without meaning to. Master Edmund, Mrs. Pruitt continued, will introduce himself formally and ask you about your educational background within the first 10 minutes. He is not being impertinent. He simply needs to understand who he is dealing with before he decides how to behave. I recommend being honest about your qualifications and not inflating them. He will find out if you do. And James? Mrs. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Master James, she said carefully, will not introduce himself. He will watch you from a distance and make an assessment, and then he will test it. The test usually involves something broken or something missing. What do you recommend? Do not show alarm, Mrs. Pruitt said. He expects alarm. He is looking for the moment when your patience runs out, because that is what has always happened, and in a strange way, the consistency of it comforts him. If you are consistent in the other direction, if you do not run out of patience, he will not know what to do, and he will have to think of something new. Eleanor considered this. That is a perceptive reading of a 9-year-old. I have known Master James for 9 years, Mrs. Pruitt said, which was a perfect and sufficient explanation. They arrived at Blackmere Hall in the late afternoon, when the sky had gone a deep winter blue, and the Yorkshire moors stretched out in all directions in their brown and grey enormity. Eleanor had seen grand houses before, but Blackmere Hall stopped the breath for a moment simply by its scale. Stone, severe, old, crouching against the hillside like something that had grown there rather than been built. Windows lit from inside glowed amber against the cold. It was not a welcoming house in the way that some houses were welcoming. It was a house that demanded something from you, steadiness perhaps, a willingness to be present without shrinking. Eleanor climbed out of the coach and stood looking at it for one moment. Then she picked up her bag and followed Mrs. Pruitt inside. The entrance hall was stone-flagged and high-ceilinged, hung with old portraits that had the slightly faded quality of paintings that had watched many people come and go. A fire burned in the massive hearth at the far end. 2 of the kitchen maids were there, and the groundskeeper's wife, a Mrs. Alling, a round, cheerful woman who greeted Mrs. Pruitt with relief, and Eleanor with a firm handshake. "They are in the upstairs hall," Mrs. Alling said. "Edmund has been reading all day. James disappeared for about 2 hours this afternoon, but came back on his own accord. And Theodore," she hesitated, then smiled in a way that suggested she had given up trying to describe Theodore accurately. "Theodore is being Theodore." Eleanor was shown up the main staircase and along a corridor. Mrs. Pruitt pushed open a door at the end and stepped back to let Eleanor through. It was a long sitting room, used evidently as a schoolroom and general gathering space for the boys. There was a large table near the window with books stacked on it, a rug in front of the fireplace, and several shelves of things. Toys, some, but also rocks and dried flowers and what appeared to be a collection of bird feathers organized by size, and books everywhere. The kind of organized disorder that comes from children who genuinely use the things around them. Edmund Harrow was standing near the bookshelf when Eleanor entered. He was tall for 13, already showing the height that would make him look like his father, with dark hair and watchful eyes and an expression that was so carefully composed it was almost more revealing than if he had simply let his face do what it wanted. He looked at Eleanor the way someone looks at a problem they are not sure they want to solve. He crossed the room and held out his hand. "Miss Voss," he said, "I am Edmund Harrow. I understand you will be in charge of our lessons and general welfare." Eleanor shook his hand. His grip was firm, which was not natural for a 13-year-old. It had been practiced. "Yes," she said, "though I would say less in charge and more responsible for. There is a difference." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "What is the difference?" "In charge suggests I make all decisions. Responsible for suggests I pay attention to what you need and try to help you get it. The first is simpler, but the second is more useful." Another moment. "Then, what were your previous positions?" 3 years with Lady Ashworth in London," Eleanor said. "Before that, 2 years with the Kellaway family in Bristol. Before that, 1 year with the Nortons in Bath as an assistant." "What subjects do you teach?" "Mathematics, English composition and literature, French, Latin, geography, natural history, and music theory. I can also manage drawing lessons, though I am more a competent teacher of drawing than a talented artist myself." She said this because it was true, and she had found over the years that admitting limitations early was more useful than having them discovered later. Edmund considered this list. "I already read Latin," he said. "Good. Then you can translate for me when I get the tenses wrong." He looked at her again, that same long, assessing look. Something very small shifted in his expression, so small she might have imagined it. "James is somewhere," he said, turning back toward the window. "I do not know where specifically. He was in the east corridor about an hour ago." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She looked around the room. "And Theodore?" There was a very small sound from the direction of the large armchair near the fire. Eleanor turned to look at it. The back of the chair was facing her, and it appeared to be empty. Then she walked around it. Theodore Harrow was curled in the chair with a blanket pulled up to his chin and a picture book open on his lap. Though he was not looking at the book, he was looking at Eleanor. He had the roundest, darkest eyes Eleanor had ever seen on a small person, wide and serious and absolutely still. He looked like a child in a painting, except that paintings did not have that quality of total concentrated attention. "Hello, Theodore," Eleanor said. She did not crouch down to his level in the theatrical way that people sometimes did with small children, as though getting lower would make them less alarming. She stayed where she was, at a respectful distance, and she did not smile the oversized, compensatory smile that adults often deployed with quiet children, as though volume of expression could substitute for genuine warmth. She simply looked at him, comfortable in the silence, and waited. Theodore looked back. His fingers moved slightly on the edge of his blanket. Then, very slowly, very deliberately, he lifted one hand and gave her a small, careful wave. Eleanor nodded in return. "Nice to meet you," she said. She turned back to the room and began to take stock of the space with a professional eye. What the shelves contained, what was missing, what the light was like from the different windows, what the table arrangement suggested about how the previous governesses had organized the space. She was doing this when the door opened and James came in. She recognized him from Sebastian's description. 9 years old, dark like his brothers but with a quality of energy about him that the others did not have, something coiled and ready. His coat was muddy at the knees and his hair had escaped whatever arrangement it had started the day in. He stopped when he saw Eleanor. They looked at each other. "You are the new one," James said. "I am Eleanor Voss," Eleanor said. "You are James." "I know who I am." "Of course," Eleanor said. She turned back to the shelf she had been examining. "I was just establishing that we are both aware of who we are, which is a reasonable starting point." James stared at the back of her head. This was clearly not the response he had prepared for. He came further into the room, circled around toward the fireplace, and sat down on the rug with the deliberate casualness of someone who was not being casual at all. "The last governess left after 3 weeks," he said. "So I understand." "The one before her left after 4 days." "That is a short time," Eleanor agreed. She pulled a book off the shelf, examined its spine, and put it back. "Are you going to leave?" James asked. Eleanor turned to look at him. He was sitting with his arms around his knees on the rug, and for all his bravado, he looked exactly like what he was, a 9-year-old boy who had watched too many people walk out the door, and had decided the easiest way to manage that was to make them go sooner rather than later, so the waiting was at least shorter. She pulled a chair from the table, set it near the fire, not close enough to be intrusive, and sat down. "Not today," she said. "Are you hungry?" "I am." James stared at her. "It is not dinner time." "I did not say dinner. I said I was hungry. We have been traveling since morning and I had a small lunch. I expect you have had a better day than I have on that front, but if you have not, we could both go downstairs and see if Mrs. Pruitt has anything sensible in the kitchen." She paused. "You do not have to come." James did not say anything. He looked at the fire. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he said, grudgingly, with a visible effort, "There is cake. Mrs. Alling made it yesterday." "That sounds like exactly the right thing," Eleanor said. She stood. James stood. Theodore extracted himself from the chair with the blanket still around his shoulders and walked quietly to Eleanor's side, and she let him take hold of the edge of her sleeve without looking down at him, because looking down at him would have made it into a moment, and it was better if it was simply something that happened. Edmund stayed by the window. "I have already had cake," he said, which was both true and not quite the point. "Then you may come for the company," Eleanor said, and went to the door. A moment passed. Then Edmund set down his book and followed. That was the first evening. It was not harmonious. Dinner was an exercise in navigation. James knocked over his water glass and watched Eleanor's face as he did it, and Eleanor mopped it up and kept talking about the drive through Yorkshire without commenting on the water or the watching. Theodore ate steadily and seriously, and occasionally looked at Eleanor from the corners of his eyes. Edmund asked her 11 questions about her opinions on various literary and scientific subjects, and corrected 2 of her facts with a precision that was both accurate and somewhat pointed. After dinner, Eleanor read aloud for half an hour from a book she had brought in her bag, an adventure story, not an improving text, the kind that had a proper pace to it and made you want to know what came next. Theodore climbed into the big chair and fell asleep before the chapter ended. James lay on the rug and stopped interrupting around page 4, which Eleanor counted as a victory. Edmund read his own book but had quietly moved his chair closer to hers over the course of the half hour, close enough that when she turned a page he could see the words. She did not comment on this. Later, after the boys had been ushered to their rooms by Mrs. Pruitt, Eleanor sat alone in the schoolroom in the dying firelight and thought about the day. She thought about Edmund's practiced handshake and James's tipped water glass and the small weight of Theodore's fingers on her sleeve. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt's advice, do not run out of patience. She thought about Sebastian Harrow's face in the study in London, the way the flat plainness of his voice when he said Theodore has not spoken since his mother died was the measure of everything he was carrying, and had been carrying, quietly, alone, for 4 years. She had come to Blackmere Hall because she had no other option. She had accepted a position in a duke's household because collapsing on his front step had turned out to be, in its accidental way, the best thing that had happened to her in months. But sitting in the schoolroom of a house she did not yet know, in the company of 3 boys she was only beginning to understand, Eleanor felt something shift quietly in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite belonging, but something adjacent to both. something small and serious and new. She got up, banked the fire, and went to her room. She had work to do in the morning. 3 weeks into her time at Blackmere Hall, Eleanor discovered that James had removed all the nibs from every pen in the schoolroom. She found this out on a Monday morning when she set a writing exercise and the boys settled at the table, and James picked up a pen and pressed it to paper and nothing happened, and his face was the face of someone working extremely hard not to look pleased with himself. Eleanor looked at her own pen. She put it down. She looked at James. "How long did that take you?" she asked. James blinked. He had not expected this question. "An hour," he said before he could stop himself. "That is a significant amount of effort," Eleanor said. "You must be curious about whether it works." "I know it works," James said, which told her he had tested it before she arrived. Eleanor nodded. "Right, then. Since we do not have pens this morning, we will do something else." She stood up and went to the bookshelves and selected a large atlas. Geography. No writing required. She opened it on the table. "James, you know the moors around here better than I do. Show me on this map where you go when you run." James stared at her. "What?" "When you go out across the moors, show me where you end up." She slid the atlas toward him and tapped the map of Yorkshire. "I have been walking only around the near grounds. I would like to know the landscape better." The silence lasted 6 full seconds. Then James pulled the atlas toward him, found the page, and pointed to a spot about 3 miles from the house. "There is a ruin of an old tower here," he said, despite himself. "You can see all the way to the valley on clear days. Have you been inside? The floor is not safe. But you have been inside." He looked up at her. "Yes. What was it like?" And James Harrow, 9 years old and angry with the world, began to describe the ruin, the crumbling stone stairs, the way the wind made a particular sound through the gap in the west wall, the rooks that nested in the highest corner, the scratch marks on one of the stones that he had decided were made by someone a very long time ago who wanted to leave a mark. He talked for 6 minutes without stopping. He was not a child who lacked words. He was a child who had learned that words were often met with things he did not want. Correction, dismissal, management. Eleanor let him talk. She leaned over the atlas and followed his descriptions with her finger on the map, and when he finished, she said, "I would like to see it sometime, if you would be willing to show me." He looked at her again with that complicated look, suspicious, wanting, not ready to be wanting. "It is far," he said. 3 miles. I can walk 3 miles. He said nothing, but he did not say no. And when Eleanor turned the atlas page to a map of the coastline and asked him which he thought looked harder to navigate, moorland or sea cliffs, the lesson that followed was genuine. "Not painless," James interrupted 3 times, contradicted her twice, and at one point picked up Edmund's ruler and tapped it against the table with a rhythm that was clearly designed to be irritating, but genuine. He was in the room. He was paying attention, even when he was pretending not to. That afternoon, Eleanor found all the pen nibs carefully arranged in a line along the windowsill of the east corridor, as though someone had put them there for safekeeping rather than mischief. She picked them up and returned them to the penholder in the schoolroom without saying anything to anyone. Edmund was the next challenge, and Edmund's challenges were quieter and therefore more precise. He did not break things. He did not disappear. He simply put up a perfectly polished wall of compliance and intelligence and then waited behind it for Eleanor to prove she was worth letting in. He completed every exercise she set with thorough, impeccable accuracy. He answered every question she asked with complete, well-organized sentences, and he maintained a distance that was perfectly correct and absolutely impenetrable. Eleanor tried different approaches. She set exercises that had no single right answer, opinion questions, interpretation questions, problems that required judgment rather than knowledge. Edmund wrote beautiful responses to all of them, carefully balanced, meticulous, and revealing almost nothing about what he actually thought. She tried discussing books. He discussed them graciously and extensively and without once letting her see whether he loved them or merely respected them. She tried asking him direct questions about himself. He answered politely and moved the conversation elsewhere with a skill that she could only call impressive. On the 17th day, she tried something different. She sat down next to him at the table rather than across from him. Not a large gesture, but it moved the geography of the interaction, placed them side by side rather than face to face. She put a book between them, a book of natural history with detailed illustrations, and she began reading a passage aloud, not asking him to respond, not explaining what they were doing, simply reading. After a moment, she stopped. "This is wrong," she said. Edmund looked at the page. "The illustration of the barn owl," Eleanor said. "The wingspan measurement in the caption does not match the one I read in a different book. I am not certain which is correct. Do you know anything about barn owls? There was a pause. Then, very carefully, as though testing the weight of the ice before stepping onto it, the other book is right, Edmund said. The barn owl has a larger wingspan than that. I have seen them on the moor at dusk. They are larger than people expect. You have watched them? Eleanor said. Another pause, shorter this time. Yes, from my window. There is a pair that hunts in the lower field. He was quiet for a moment. I have been watching them for 2 winters. What do you notice about them? And Edmund Harrow, the boy who had been managing himself quietly for 4 years, talked about the barn owls for 11 minutes. Not performed, not composed, not organized into careful paragraphs. He talked the way someone talks when they have been watching something closely for a long time, and finally have someone to tell. He described the angle of their flight, the way they move differently in different winds, the one with the slightly damaged tail feather who had survived the previous winter and come back, which Edmund had checked because he had measured the tail feather asymmetry against his notes from the winter before. Eleanor listened. She asked real questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. She did not manage the conversation. She simply had it. When Edmund finally stopped, he looked at the table, then at Eleanor, then at the table again. There was something in his face that was not quite embarrassment. It was more like the expression of someone who has said more than they meant to and is waiting to find out if that was a mistake. That is remarkable, Eleanor said. About the tail feather, do you keep notebooks, records of what you observe? Yes, Edmund said. He said it carefully, still waiting. May I see them? The pause this time was the longest yet. She could see him measuring the risk, turning it over, checking it from different angles the way he checked everything. Then he stood up, went to his room, and came back with 2 notebooks. He set them on the table between them and sat back down. Eleanor opened the first one. Edmund's handwriting was very small and very precise, and the records inside were not the work of a child who had been told to write things down. They were the work of someone who had developed their own system, their own notation, their own way of organizing what they saw. The drawings were detailed and accurate. The dates were meticulous. There were sketches of wing positions and notes on weather conditions and small maps showing the hunting range shifts through the seasons. Edmund, Eleanor said quietly, this is extraordinary work. He said nothing, but he did not take the notebooks back. After that, something changed. It was not immediate, and it was not dramatic. Edmund did not suddenly become an open book. He remained thoughtful, measured, and precise. But the wall was a degree thinner. He began to volunteer observations and lessons rather than waiting to be called on. He began to correct her mistakes not with the flat precision of someone proving a point, but with the tone of someone who assumed they were on the same side. Once during a Latin lesson, he laughed. It was brief, a single, startled sound at a particularly poor translation she had offered, and he caught it almost immediately and composed his face back to its usual careful arrangement. But it had happened. Eleanor did not remark on it. She simply noted it privately as one of the better things that had occurred in the schoolroom that week. Theodore remained a different kind of conversation. He followed Eleanor through the house, not obtrusively. He was extraordinarily good at being present without imposing, but consistently. She would be in the kitchen asking Mrs. Pruitt about the household schedule, and turn around to find Theodore sitting on the kitchen bench with his drawing book, drawing something with complete concentration. She would be walking in the near gardens and realize after a few minutes that there was a small figure about 20 steps behind her, also looking at the hedgerows. She would be sitting in the schoolroom preparing the next day's lessons in the evening, and become aware of a stillness near the doorway that was not the house settling. She did not tell him to stop. She did not make it into an event. She simply let him be near her, and when she spoke to him, she spoke at a comfortable distance, without urgency, without the look that people gave him. The careful, attentive, slightly anxious look that said they were waiting for him to speak so they could feel relieved. She did not wait for him to speak. She spoke to him as she would speak to anyone. She told him what she was thinking about as they walked. She described what she was reading when she was reading it. She asked him questions that could be answered with a nod, or a shake of his head, or one of the small, careful gestures he had developed, and she accepted those answers with the same ease she would have accepted spoken ones. One afternoon, 5 weeks into her time at Blackmere, she was in the schoolroom cutting paper for a map project. Theodore was at the far end of the table with his drawing things. The house was quiet. Edmund was in the library. James was outside with the groundskeeper's son. The fire was warm, and the light was the particular golden quality of late winter afternoon when the sun comes in low and catches the dust in the air. Theodore got up from his place. He walked to Eleanor's end of the table and stood beside her. He watched her cut the paper for a moment. Then he picked up a piece and looked at it and put it down. He picked up the scissors, small safety scissors from the craft supplies, not Eleanor's sharper ones, and he looked at them. "Would you like to help?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her. She set the scissors down in a position where he could reach them easily. She put a piece of paper in front of him. She showed him the shape she was cutting, a rough outline of England, for the geography lesson. Then she went back to her own cutting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Theodore Harrow picked up the scissors and, with enormous concentration and the tip of his tongue visible between his teeth, began to cut. He cut the shape wrong. It came out more like an irregular oval than a country. He held it up and looked at it. "Wales is a little larger in yours," Eleanor said, without looking up, "but it has very good borders. You could say it represents an alternate geography of Britain." Theodore looked at the shape. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he put the shape down very carefully in the pile of finished pieces and picked up another piece of paper and started again. They sat like that for 40 minutes, cutting shapes in the afternoon light, and it was one of the most peaceful 40 minutes Eleanor had experienced in longer than she could easily calculate. When Sebastian Harrow came up that evening to check on the boys, he did this once a week, appearing in the schoolroom doorway with the manner of a man who wanted to be reassured but was not sure how to ask for reassurance. Eleanor was reading aloud again and all three boys were in the room. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Eleanor looked up. They exchanged a brief nod, professional, unremarkable. He looked at the scene in the room. He looked at Theodore, curled in the big chair with his blanket, and at James on the rug, and at Edmund in his chair that had been, over the past weeks, slowly migrating toward Eleanor's reading chair, in small, barely perceptible increments. Sebastian said nothing. He stepped back from the doorway, but he stood there, outside the room, for longer than he needed to before he walked away down the corridor. Eleanor heard his footsteps receding and turned the page and kept reading. Outside, the moor was dark and cold and the wind moved across it in long sweeps that made the grass sound like water. Inside, three boys listened to a story, and Eleanor read, and the fire made its soft sounds, and nobody needed anything more than what was already there. The 5th month brought early spring to Yorkshire, not warmly, not gently, but in the way the north manages it, which is to say that the snow was still in the creases of the moor, and the wind had not yet decided to be pleasant, but there were yellow crocuses pushing through the cold earth near the garden wall, and the days were getting longer in the particular way that feels like a promise. Eleanor had fallen into the rhythms of Blackmere Hall the way water falls into a bowl. Steadily, fully, without drama. She knew which stairs creaked. She knew that Mrs. Pruitt liked to hear about any changes to the boys' meals before they happened rather than after. She knew that the east corridor was the warmest and that Theodore would migrate there on particularly cold mornings with his drawing book. She knew that Edmund was most talkative in the hour after dinner and most contained in the mornings before 10. She knew that James would behave better on days when he had been outside for at least 2 hours, and that the best way to get him outside was to put her own coat on and open the back door and say she was going to walk and he did not have to come. He always came. She was beginning to learn the house itself, too, its specific silences, its sounds in different weathers, the way the light changed through the day in the upper rooms. She had learned which rooms Sebastian used regularly and which ones he moved through quickly, his study on the ground floor, the dining room, though he often ate late and ate simply, the library, which he visited at odd hours, and where Eleanor had begun to find evidence of his reading, books pulled from shelves and left at angles that meant he had been interrupted mid-reach, or put back slightly wrong, which was how you could tell a book had been genuinely read rather than replaced. She had her own books in the library now. She had asked Mrs. Pruitt if it was appropriate to use the library for her own reading, and Mrs. Pruitt had said she could not see why not, which Eleanor interpreted as permission, and which Mrs. Pruitt may have intended as something more consequential, though she did not say so. She saw Sebastian perhaps twice a week. He was in London sometimes, Parliament and business taking him there for 3 or 4 days at a stretch. When he was at Blackmere, he was occupied and self-contained, and their interactions were brief, professional, and without difficulty. He asked about the boys. She reported honestly. He thanked her. She withdrew. It was what it was supposed to be. And then one Tuesday evening in March, Eleanor came downstairs at 9:30 to get a book she had left in the library, and found Sebastian already there. He was standing near the shelves with a book open in his hands, not reading it exactly but not quite doing something else. The posture of a man who had been standing for a while and was thinking. The lamp on the table was lit, and there was no fire in this room in the evenings. He wore no jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow in the way of a man who had stopped performing the day and was simply himself. He looked up when she came in. "I am sorry, Eleanor said. I left a book. I will not be a moment. You are not interrupting anything, he said. He looked back at the book in his hands. What were you reading? She found her book. She could see it on the small table near the window where she'd left it, and she picked it up. A history of the Flemish wool trade in the 14th century, she said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that might have been amusement, or might have been simple interest. It was hard to tell with him. That is very specific. It is very interesting, she said. The merchant guild systems were extraordinary. The way they organized labor and trade standards across borders, 300 years before anyone thought to write it down as theory. He was quiet for a moment. Why? Why was it interesting? Why does it matter to you? Eleanor stopped. It was a direct question, the kind that cut through the comfortable surface of conversation and wanted something real. She thought about it genuinely, the actual reason, not the reasonable-sounding one. Because I have been poor very recently, she said, and reading about the organized systems that allowed ordinary people to negotiate their own economic circumstances without needing to rely entirely on the benevolence of those above them, that seems relevant, personally relevant. She had not planned to say that. She said it, and then held very still to see what would happen. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. Sit down, he said, if you are not tired. It was not quite an invitation, and not quite a command. Eleanor sat in the chair near the table with the lamp on it. He closed his book and set it on the shelf and came to the chair across from her. The room was cool and the lamps were warm, and from outside came the distant sound of wind off the moor. How did they organize it? Sebastian asked. The guilds? Yes. So Eleanor told him. She told him about the wool merchants of Bruges and the way the guild system worked, the price agreements and the quality standards, the way workers could bring complaints through established channels rather than simply accepting what they were given. She told him about the women weavers, who had their own sub-guilds and more economic agency than their counterparts in most other industries of the period. She told it the way she told the boys their stories, without performing, without showing off, with genuine enthusiasm for the actual material, and a pace that moved quickly enough to stay interesting. Sebastian listened the way he listened to everything, very still, very attentive, saying nothing superfluous. He asked 2 questions, both of them good ones. When she finished, he said, You are a genuinely good teacher. I have been told that before, Eleanor said, because false modesty seemed pointless. Not as a compliment, he said, as an observation. There is a difference. She looked at him. The lamplight was between them, warm and steady. You have been listening to my lessons, she said. I have been passing the schoolroom door, he said, which was the same thing, and they both knew it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have said more than they expected to, and are deciding quietly whether that was all right. Eleanor looked at the window, the glass dark with night, the moor invisible behind it. She looked at her book in her lap. She looked, carefully and briefly, at Sebastian Harrow's hands, which were folded together on his knee, and she thought, with the part of her mind that was always watching and noting and trying to understand the people around her, that he held himself like a man who had been bracing against something for a very long time, and had almost forgotten that the something might stop. Edmund showed me his notebooks last week, she said, the natural history records. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. He showed you? He brought them from his room. I had expressed curiosity about the barn owls and he wanted to show me the data. Another silence, longer this time. She could see, in the lamplight, something moving in Sebastian's expression, not fully visible, not available to be read completely, but there, the knowledge that his son had brought someone a notebook he had been keeping privately for 2 winters. He told me, Sebastian said slowly, when he was 7, that he wanted to be a naturalist. He told me as if he was confessing something. I told him it was a fine ambition. He paused. I did not ask him what kind. I did not ask him what he was already studying. I said it was fine, and went back to whatever I was doing. He looked at his folded hands. He never mentioned it again. Eleanor did not say anything immediately. She let the sentence sit, because it deserved to sit. He is still studying, she said after a moment. He has not stopped. The notebooks go back 3 years. Sebastian looked at her. His expression was difficult to read, not because it was closed exactly, but because what was in it was too many things at once to sort easily. Gratitude, and something that resembled grief, and something else she could not name precisely. Thank you, he said. It was very simple and very plain and meant something larger than its size. He is an extraordinary boy, Eleanor said. They all are. She said it not as reassurance. She had no interest in reassuring people with things she did not mean, but because it was the actual truth and felt worth saying. "Yes," Sebastian said. He looked at the window. "I have not always known how to." He stopped. The sentence hovered unfinished. Eleanor waited. "My wife knew them," he said. "She understood each of them in a specific way. She knew what Edmund needed, and she knew how to reach James, and she knew—" He stopped again. His jaw moved. "Theodore was 1 year old when she died. He does not remember her, but he looks like her, and sometimes I find it difficult to—" He stopped again. The room was very quiet. Eleanor understood that she was being told something that had not been told to many people. She understood this the way she understood the shape of a room in the dark, through instinct and care and the particular quality of silence that surrounds a statement when the person saying it has been carrying it for a very long time. "You do not need to say it," she said gently. He looked at her. He gave a single, very slight nod, which was the most open thing she had seen him do. They sat in the library for another half-hour. They did not talk about personal things again. He asked about the boys' progress in their lessons. She told him, honestly and in detail, including the parts that were difficult and the parts that were moving forward. He asked if she needed anything for the schoolroom. She told him about the atlas with the outdated maps and the gaps in the science books. He made a note. When she stood to leave, he stood as well, because he was that kind of man. She went to the door. She stopped. "Your Grace," she said. "Yes." "James knows the location of a ruined tower on the North Moor, about 3 miles from the house. He has been going there alone. I am going to ask him to take me there this week. I wanted you to know, in case Mrs. Pruitt mentions that we have gone out in that direction." Sebastian looked at her for a moment. "He will take you?" "I believe so. He has not said no." Another moment. Then, very quietly, "Good," he said. "He used to go with his mother." Eleanor let that land. She gave it the space it deserved. Then she said goodnight, and she walked back up the stairs to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed and held her book in her lap and thought about everything that had been said and not said in the library, about notebooks kept for 2 years in private, about a boy who ran to a ruined tower on the moor, where he had once been with someone who was gone. She thought about Sebastian Harrow saying that his wife understood each of their sons in a specific way, and the pause that had followed, and the space after the pause where he had not been able to finish the sentence about Theodore. She thought about the fact that she was a disgraced governess in a borrowed position, sleeping in a house that did not belong to her, employed by a man who had made clear from the beginning that their relationship was professional and nothing beyond it. She was very careful with her thinking. She was very precise about what she let herself conclude, and what she filed away without conclusions. She was not a woman who permitted herself to want things that were not available to her, because she had learned very early that wanting such things was the fastest route to a very specific kind of pain. She was careful, she was sensible, she was a professional in this household, and she intended to remain one. She got into bed. She read 11 pages of the Flemish wool merchants. She put the book down and looked at the ceiling. She was careful, she was. But she also knew, sitting with that clear and inconvenient honesty that was her most deep and persistent habit, that there was something about Sebastian Harrow that had become part of the texture of her days, something about the way he was with words, precise and slow and true, that she had started, without quite meaning to look forward to. Something about the quality of his attention, the way he listened with his whole self, the way his stillness was not emptiness but fullness. She knew this, and then she put it on the high shelf at the back of her mind, where she kept the things that were true and not useful, and she went to sleep. The morning would have lessons in it. The morning would have 3 boys in a schoolroom and work she genuinely loved. That was more than enough. That was in fact more than she had allowed herself to hope for. 35 days ago, standing in the rain outside a closed employment office with no coat and a stone in her chest. It was more than enough. She was sure of it. She was nearly entirely sure of it. The letter arrived on a Friday morning in December, 7 months after Eleanor had first come to Blackmere Hall. It arrived with the other post, and Eleanor would not have known it existed except that Mrs. Pruitt mentioned, with the careful neutrality of someone conveying important information without editorializing, that the Duke's sister, Lady Harriet, was coming for the Christmas season and was bringing 2 friends. Eleanor absorbed this and continued correcting Theodore's maps. Theodore had made excellent progress in geography over the autumn. His maps were now recognizable, his labels placed correctly, and he had developed a particular enthusiasm for coastlines, which he drew with loving, detailed attention. She checked his work and put a small mark of approval on the page, and Theodore looked at the mark and looked at her and gave her a single solemn nod. The house changed when Lady Harriet arrived. Eleanor had not quite anticipated the particular way a house changes when someone enters it who has history in it, who belongs to it in a way that is separate from the current arrangements. Lady Harriet was 40, blonde where her brother was dark, and immediately warm in the way that suggested warmth was genuinely her nature rather than a performance. She swept into the entrance hall on a Thursday afternoon, saw the three boys lined up in a row because Mrs. Pruitt had arranged it, and swept them into an embrace that Edmund bore with dignified discomfort, and James endured with his eyes on the ceiling, and Theodore accepted with the concentrated seriousness with which he accepted all physical affection. She found Eleanor in the corridor on her way back upstairs and stopped. "You are Miss Voss," Lady Harriet said. She looked at Eleanor with the frank appraisal of someone who had been curious for some time. "I have heard about you." "Good things, I hope," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Remarkable things, actually. Theodore waved at you from the upstairs window as our carriage came up the drive." Eleanor did not let her expression change in any particular way, though something moved briefly in her chest. "He is becoming quite communicative," she said. Lady Harriet looked at her for another moment with bright, intelligent eyes. "Yes," she said. "I can see that might be connected." And she moved on, leaving Eleanor slightly uncertain whether she had been studied and found wanting or studied and found interesting. The two friends Lady Harriet had brought were a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Colton, pleasant people from Northumberland who talked a great deal about horses and seemed content to sit near fires with good books and expect nothing dramatic from their holiday. They were not the difficulty. The difficulty arrived on Saturday. The difficulty arrived by a different carriage entirely, unannounced, 2 days after Lady Harriet, because Lady Ashworth had been invited to spend Christmas at a neighboring estate, and had taken it upon herself to call on Blackmere Hall when she learned that Harriet was there. They had known each other for years, apparently. They had been at school at roughly the same time and had maintained the vague social proximity of women from similar backgrounds who are in the same circles without being exactly friends. Eleanor was in the schoolroom when Mrs. Pruitt came to her door with a look on her face that Eleanor had not seen before, not quite alarmed but very close to it. "Lady Ashworth is in the drawing room with Lady Harriet," Mrs. Pruitt said. She paused, just slightly longer than a normal pause. "She is expected for dinner." Eleanor understood immediately. "Thank you," she said. "I will be in the schoolroom if I am needed." She was not in the schoolroom at dinner, because dinner was a household event, and her position at Blackmere Hall meant she sat at table with the family when guests were present. Sebastian had established this at the beginning, somewhat to Eleanor's surprise. She had expected to eat separately, as governesses typically did. He had told her, in the same plain way he told her everything, that Blackmere had always run differently from typical houses, and he saw no reason to change it for convention. So Eleanor dressed carefully, her better dress, the deep blue one she had been wearing when she arrived in London 7 months ago and which she had since had cleaned and pressed. She pinned her hair neatly. She looked at herself in the mirror in the same way she had looked at herself the morning she had stood in the hallway of the Ashworth house, assessing, preparing, making sure she was ready. She walked downstairs and into the dining room. She was seated to the left of Edmund, who was at table because he was 13 and deemed old enough for formal dinners. James and Theodore ate earlier. The drawing room gathering before dinner had been brief, and Eleanor had managed it by entering quietly, taking a glass of water from the footman, and speaking to Mr. Colton about his horses in a way that kept her back half-turned to the rest of the room. She had seen Lady Ashworth across the room. Lady Ashworth had seen her. The recognition had been immediate and mutual, and had lasted exactly 1 second before both of them turned away. It could have remained exactly like that. Eleanor had decided to let it be so. She had nothing to gain from a confrontation, and no interest in creating a scene in Sebastian Harrow's house. The problem was that Lady Ashworth was not interested in leaving it alone. It started at the soup course. Lady Ashworth was seated on the other side of the table, near Harriet, which was far enough away that she would have needed to raise her voice to address Eleanor directly. She was too skilled a social operator for that. She addressed the table generally, with a smile that was very practiced and very bright. "Miss Voss," she said, with the particular tone of someone drawing attention to something while pretending not to. "What a surprise to find you here. I had heard you had left London." The table went a degree quieter. Eleanor set down her soup spoon. She looked across the table. She kept her face pleasant. "Yes," she said. "I moved to Yorkshire in November. The air is much better." Lady Ashworth smiled. It did not reach her eyes. Nothing ever reached Lady Ashworth's eyes unless it was going to be useful to her. "Yorkshire suits you, perhaps. I always thought you had more of a country disposition." Eleanor translated this accurately. She was implying Eleanor was not sophisticated enough for London. "Possibly," Eleanor said, and returned to her soup. But Lady Ashworth was not finished. She waited 3 courses. She was good at waiting. And it was during the fish that she brought out the full weight of it, with the casualness of someone producing something they have been holding in reserve and wish to deploy to maximum effect. "I believe we have a mutual connection, Mr. Colton," Lady Ashworth said, turning to the man from Northumberland. "Did you not say your wife's cousin is Mrs. Plimpton, at the employment agency on Cavendish Street?" Mr. Colton looked vaguely uncertain in the way of men who do not quite follow conversational tides. "Ah, yes, I believe so." "A good agency," Lady Ashworth said pleasantly. "I have found excellent staff through them over the years, though of course, one must always be careful. I lost a piece of jewelry once, a very precious one, and it taught me that one cannot be too careful about the people one admits to one's household." She paused, with the weight of a professional pause, the kind that lands a statement and then waits for the audience to do the rest. One thinks one knows people, and then, she made a small expressive gesture. The table was quiet. Eleanor could feel the attention, the way people at a dinner table orient themselves toward something interesting in the way flowers orient toward light. She could feel Edmund to her left go very still. She looked at Lady Ashworth. She kept her face perfectly composed. She did not look at Sebastian. "I believe you are referring to the pearl brooch," Eleanor said. Her voice was completely even. "I did not take it. I said so at the time, and I say so now, and that is all I will say on the subject in company." The silence was precise and sharp. Lady Ashworth's smile held, though it required more effort now. "Of course," she said. "I meant no specific." "You meant every specific," Edmund said. The table turned. Every head turned to look at Edmund Harrow, who was 13 years old and sitting very upright in his chair, with his jaw set in an expression that Eleanor recognized as the exact expression his father wore when he had finished deliberating and arrived at a conclusion. "Edmund," Sebastian said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "She is saying that Miss Voss stole something," Edmund said, and he said it directly to his father, not defensively, but with precision. "I want to say, in front of everyone, that Miss Voss has been in our house for 7 months and nothing has gone missing, and I do not believe she has ever in her life taken anything that did not belong to her, and I think it is not right that someone should say otherwise over dinner in our house." The silence was very long this time. Lady Ashworth had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mr. Colton examined his fish with sudden deep interest. Lady Harriet, across the table, was looking at Edmund with an expression that was somehow both startled and deeply approving. Eleanor looked at Edmund. She did not let anything show on her face, but something happened in her chest, large and warm and completely involuntary, at the sight of this boy who had spent 7 months behind a wall of careful composure, delivering himself fully and plainly into the middle of this room on her behalf. "Thank you, Edmund," she said quietly. Sebastian's gaze moved from his son to Lady Ashworth and back to Eleanor. His expression was, as usual, difficult to read completely. He said nothing further at the table. The dinner continued. Lady Ashworth was somewhat quieter. Edmund was somewhat more collected than his outburst might have suggested. He returned to eating his fish with a deliberateness that said he had said what he meant to say and was not ashamed of it. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself early. She went upstairs. She stood in the corridor outside the schoolroom for a moment, one hand against the wall, not quite steady in a way that had nothing to do with her legs. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Sebastian Harrow was in the corridor. "I would like to speak with you tomorrow morning," he said. "At 9, in the study, if that is convenient." "Of course," Eleanor said. He looked at her. The lamplight in the corridor was dim, and she could not read his expression precisely, but she could see that he was looking at her with an attention that was not the professional assessment of the first day, but something that had changed shape over 7 months, into something less definable. "Good night, Miss Voss," he said. "Good night, Your Grace." He turned and walked back down the corridor. Eleanor watched him go. She went to her room. She sat down on the bed and she thought about Edmund's face and the precision of his voice, and she thought about the way he had looked at his father and delivered those words without flinching. Because he was his father's son through and through, he had thought about it first, and then he had said exactly what he meant. And she thought, that boy is going to be all right. She thought it without qualification, not carefully, not with reservations, not with the professional distance she tried to maintain between herself and what she felt about the people in this house. She thought it with the straightforward certainty of someone who has watched something grow and is no longer pretending they are indifferent to the outcome. Edmund Harrow was going to be all right. She was more certain of this than she had been certain of many things. Outside, the December wind moved across the moor in its cold, ancient way. Inside, the house settled around its people, and Eleanor Voss sat on her bed in the dark and let herself feel, Just for a moment, the full weight of the 7 months she had spent here. The knife fights at the table and the pen nibs in a row on the windowsill, and the barn owl notebooks and the 40 minutes of cutting paper in the afternoon light, and the library at 9:30, and the story of the Flemish wool merchants and the sound of Sebastian's voice saying, he used to go with his mother. She held it all. She held it carefully. And then she lay down and closed her eyes and was, in spite of everything, quietly and stubbornly at peace. Sebastian did not sleep well that night. He lay awake with the particular alertness of a man whose mind is refusing to slow down, going over the dinner in the way he went over all things that troubled him, methodically, from multiple angles, not rushing toward conclusions. He thought about Edmund's face. He thought about Eleanor's face, which had remained composed and steady while his 13-year-old son had done the one thing Sebastian had failed to do, speak plainly into the difficulty. He thought about Lady Ashworth's expression in the moment after Edmund had spoken. He had known, in that moment, with complete certainty, what he was going to do. He had simply been deciding how. By 4 a.m, he had stopped pretending to be interested in sleeping. He got up, lit the lamp in his study, and sat down at his desk. He wrote the note to Lady Ashworth at 4:30. It was brief, as notes of this nature should be. He told her that he had considered the events of the evening, and had concluded that she would be more comfortable finishing her Christmas holiday at the neighboring estate, rather than calling at Blackmere again. He wrote it in a tone that was impeccably polite and unmistakably final. He sealed it, and left it with the footman to be delivered to the Gatehouse Inn where she was staying. Then he sat for a while longer and thought about other things. He thought about Eleanor Voss in the way that he thought about things he had been deliberately not thinking about, which was to say, the things came rushing in the moment he stopped keeping them at bay. 7 months of small things, the way she had said responsible for rather than in charge of, on the first day, and he had heard it from the hallway. The way she had described the Flemish wool merchants in the library with a passion that was completely unpretentious and entirely genuine. The way she had sat in the corridor outside the schoolroom that first night and listened to his sons breathe while they slept. The way Edmund had brought her his notebooks. The way Theodore reached for her sleeve. The way she had looked across the table at Lady Ashworth and said, with complete quiet steadiness, I said so at the time, and I say so now, and that is all I will say on the subject in company. He had spent 4 years in a particular kind of stillness. It was not grief, exactly, or not only grief. It was the stillness of a man who had decided that the safest course of action was to feel nothing specific about anything beyond his son's welfare and his responsibilities. He had been very good at this. He had kept the stillness perfectly for 4 years, through all the things that had happened and all the things people had said and all the quiet pressures from Harriet and his solicitor and old family friends to engage with the world in a warmer way. And then a woman had sat down on his front step in the rain, and the stillness had started to develop cracks. He was aware of this. He was not, as a general rule, a man who deceived himself about what he was feeling. What he felt and what he chose to do about it were different matters, and he had been keeping them very separate. What he felt, he had stored carefully and left alone, the way you store something valuable that you are not sure what to do with. What he chose to do had remained entirely professional, entirely correct, entirely appropriate to the circumstances. He was not sure how much longer that was going to be possible. He went to see Eleanor at 9 a.m. as arranged. She came to the study and sat in the chair across from his desk, as she always did, and she was, as she always was, composed and direct and ready to deal with whatever needed dealing with. She had come prepared to be told that her position here was complicated by what had happened the night before. He could see this in her posture, in the particular readiness of someone who has steeled themselves for difficulty. Lady Ashworth will not be returning to this house, he said. Eleanor looked at him. She waited. I have sent her a note asking her to continue her holiday elsewhere. She is an acquaintance of Harriet's, not a friend, and Harriet is, he paused, not unhappy about the decision. A small exhale. I would not have asked you to do that, Eleanor said. I know. I did not do it because you asked. He looked at her. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and it was past time I did it. She was quiet for a moment. I see. I would also like to say, he continued, that I believe Edmund's response last night, though not perhaps the most conventional piece of dinner-table behavior. It was extraordinary, Eleanor said. Was prompted by 7 months of observation, Sebastian finished. He is not a boy who acts without consideration. He had been watching you, and he had reached a conclusion, and he acted on it, in front of witnesses, at 13. He paused. That is not a small thing. No, Eleanor agreed. It is not. Sebastian looked at his desk, then at Eleanor. I also want to tell you something that I should have told you earlier, but have been, he searched for the right word, slower with than I should have been. I have not been sufficiently present for my sons. I have kept the right distance from grief, and thereby kept too much distance from them. I knew this before you came. I had not known how to change it. He was quiet. You changed it. Without changing anything about them. You simply paid attention in a way that made other people pay attention too. Eleanor sat very still. Your Grace. I am not saying this to embarrass you, he said. I am saying it because you deserve to hear it, and I am capable of saying it, and I have decided that those two facts together mean I should. The room was very quiet. Through the window, the December moor was pale under a thin sky. The Christmas greenery that Mrs. Pruitt had arranged on the mantelpiece gave the room a scent of pine. Thank you, Eleanor said. It was very simple, and meant something larger than its size, which was something she had once said to him. The corner of his mouth moved, the ghost of something. I also want to discuss Edmund's schooling, he said, and his tone shifted back into the professional register, but gently, not as a retreat, more as someone putting one thing safely down before picking up another. He is past what I can provide him at home. There is a school near York that has an excellent natural sciences program. I was considering it for next autumn. I would like your opinion. They talked about Edmund for 20 minutes. They talked about James and his progress, and Sebastian asked about the visit to the ruined tower, which Eleanor had made with James in October, and which had been, she told him honestly, one of the most important afternoons she had spent at Blackmere. James had been a different person at the tower. He had been free in a way he was not free anywhere else. And Eleanor had understood, standing among those old stones with the moor around them, and James showing her the scratch marks on the wall, that what James needed more than management was space. Space, and someone who would follow him into it. Sebastian listened to all of this. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He went there with Cecilia, he said. He was 6. She used to walk with him across the moor in the mornings. He looked at the window. I should have taken him back there. After she died, I knew he was going, and I should have offered to go with him instead of leaving it to the groundskeeper to retrieve him. Eleanor said nothing. She let it be. I did not know how, Sebastian said. It was a very plain admission. The kind that costs something. You know now, Eleanor said, with equal plainness. He looked at her. Something in the air of the study shifted, not dramatically. Not in a way that could be pointed to or catalogued, but perceptibly. The way the pressure in a room changes when a window is opened, something new in the air. Yes, he said. I think I do. The morning after Lady Ashworth's note was delivered, the atmosphere of Blackmere Hall lifted measurably. Harriet came down to breakfast with the relief of a woman who had been managing an uncomfortable social situation and no longer had to, and she sat next to Eleanor and said plainly, I want you to know that I have never liked her. I tolerated her, because social tolerating is one of the things women of my position spend their lives doing, and I am increasingly disinclined to continue the practice. She poured her tea. Sebastian made exactly the right decision. He made it himself, Eleanor said. I did not ask him to. Harriet looked at her from the corner of her eye. No, she said. That is very like him. He thinks very slowly, and then he acts very decisively. She was quiet for a moment. He has not done that in 4 years, Miss Voss. He has thought and not acted at all. She added sugar to her tea. About anything. Eleanor looked at her cup. The Christmas season settled into a different rhythm. The boys were out of their lessons, and the house was warmer than usual with fires in all the main rooms and the smell of baking from the kitchen, and Lady Harriet's cheerful organizational energy applied to decorations and games and carol singing, in which Eleanor was recruited to play the piano while Harriet sang at considerable volume, and the boys participated at varying levels of enthusiasm. James, to everyone's surprise, knew all the words to more carols than anyone else in the room. He sang them with his hands in his pockets and an air of someone who refused to appear to be enjoying himself, but who was nonetheless singing. Theodore sat beside Eleanor on the piano bench. This happened naturally, the way many things with Theodore happened, gradually, quietly, without announcement. He had been standing near the piano for the first song, then sitting on the bench beside Eleanor for the second. By the third evening of carols, it was simply understood that when Eleanor sat down at the piano, Theodore would be beside her. On Christmas Eve, during a quiet moment between songs, when Harriet had gone to find the next sheet of music and James was arguing with Mr. Colton about the proper way to light a fireplace, and Edmund was reading with his usual focused intensity in the chair by the window, Theodore leaned slightly against Eleanor's arm. She did not move. She did not look down at him. She simply let him lean. They sat like that for 2 or 3 minutes. The fire crackled. The room smelled of pine and candle wax. The wind was outside but did not come in. And then Theodore Harrow, who had not spoken since he was 1 year old, and whose silence had become something all the people around him had carefully arranged themselves to accommodate, said, very quietly and very clearly, one word into the warm air of the room: song. It was barely above a whisper. It might have been a breath, but Eleanor had been next to him with her arm against his arm, and she heard it clearly and completely and without any doubt at all. She looked at the sheet music on the piano stand. She chose a song, a simple one, a slow one. She placed her hands on the keys. She did not make anything of the moment. She did not turn to him. She did not call anyone's attention to it. She simply played. And then, into the music, very quietly, so quietly that only Eleanor could hear it, Theodore began to hum. Across the room, Edmund looked up from his book. He looked at his brother and then at Eleanor. Eleanor kept her eyes on the music. Edmund looked at his brother again. Then he looked at the window, and his jaw moved once, and he looked back at his book, and he did not read a single word of it for the next 5 minutes. Sebastian was in the doorway. He had come from the study. He had heard the piano. He had stood in the doorway of the music room for, he could not have said how long. Long enough to hear his youngest son's voice for the first time in 4 years. It was not speech. It was not much more than a sound, but it was a voice. It was Theodore's voice, small and careful and utterly its own, moving in the warm air of his house on Christmas Eve. He stood very still. He stood the way he stood when he was holding something he was afraid to disturb. He watched the back of Eleanor's head and the back of Theodore's small head, both of them bent slightly toward the piano, both of them in the same pool of lamplight, and he felt something in his chest that was not manageable, that did not fit into any of the categories he had built over the past 4 years, that was simply and completely and overwhelmingly too large for any container he had. He turned and walked back down the corridor before anyone could see his face. He walked to his study. He sat at his desk. He put his hands flat on the surface of the desk and he stared at them for a very long time. Then he stood up and walked back to the music room door and leaned against the frame and let himself hear it, the piano and the faint, careful hum. And he did not move, and he did not speak, and he did not try to contain the thing in his chest because it had clearly decided it was not going to be contained. He stayed there until the song ended. Spring came to Yorkshire with its usual indifference to human plans. The moor turned from brown to a pale, stiff green, and then, slowly, to something richer. The sky opened up in the mornings with the particular clarity of northern spring, and Eleanor began taking the lessons outside when the weather allowed. Geography on the near hillside with the actual landscape to refer to, natural history in the lower garden where Edmund could point to real specimens, and Theodore could draw what he actually saw rather than what the textbooks told him was there. James, who learned everything better when he was moving, learned it best outside entirely. He had taken to walking alongside Eleanor on their outdoor lessons with the manner of a boy who found it easier to think when he was not sitting down, and Eleanor had stopped suggesting he sit, and simply let him walk and talk and occasionally run ahead and come back, like a dog working out its energy. He covered 3 times the ground she did on any given walk, and he retained 3 times the information he retained in the classroom. His voice, when he forgot to be careful, was vivid and quick and deeply funny. He had a gift for description that he hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious about. He could describe the rooks on the moor in 6 words that made you see them completely. He could do an impression of Mr. Colton's hoarse voice that had Edmund fighting visible amusement, and even Mrs. Pruitt pressing her lips together in a way that was probably suppressing a smile. Eleanor had written this to Sebastian in her monthly report, the detailed written report she left on his desk on the 1st of each month, covering each boy's progress in lessons and what she had observed about their general development. She had included a note about James's descriptive gifts and the suggestion that writing, approached as expression rather than exercise, might be something he would take to, if given the right invitation. Sebastian had written in the margin of the report, in his small, precise hand, "Agreed. What would you suggest?" And they had had a conversation about it in the study the following week, and Sebastian had bought James a proper leather notebook and given it to him directly, which Eleanor had neither suggested nor expected, and which had produced in James a reaction of such complete, undisguised pleasure that he had immediately left the room before anyone could see his face. James came back 30 minutes later and said he had been outside, and he was carrying the notebook very carefully. The notebook became a fixture. James wrote in it, though he told no one what he wrote. He carried it everywhere, including to meals, tucked under his arm with an air of someone who happened to have a notebook and was not making anything of it. He did not share the contents. Eleanor did not ask, but she noticed that when she gave him a geography lesson that required a written element, the quality of his writing had changed. It had a pace to it now, a sense of rhythm, as though he had been practicing. Theodore's progress was slower and more private and more precious for both of those things. He had not spoken again in the way he had hummed on Christmas Eve. Not in words, but his voice had entered the world more fully since that night. Not speech, not quite, but sound. He made sounds while he drew. He made a low, thinking sound when he was working through a problem. He made a sound at breakfast when he found something particularly good, which was not exactly a word but was clearly communicative. Eleanor received all of these sounds with the same steady, quiet acknowledgement she gave to his words when he had them. She did not record them as milestones in her reports, because they were not milestones. They were simply Theodore being Theodore, gradually, on his own terms, in his own time. One morning in April, he came to the schoolroom early and found Eleanor already there, and sat across from her and watched her write, and then said, in a voice that had grown from the Christmas Eve hum into something slightly more present, "What is that?" Eleanor looked at what she was writing. "A letter," she said. She pushed it toward him slightly so he could see. "To a friend in Bristol. From my time in the Kellaway household. We have written to each other for years. Her name is Dorothy." Theodore looked at the letter. Then he said, "Do you miss her?" 2 sentences. 2 clear, complete sentences. Eleanor felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she managed quickly and thoroughly. She looked at the letter. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes. But we write, so it is manageable." She looked at Theodore. "Is there someone you miss?" He thought about this. He had the habit, she had noticed, of taking questions genuinely seriously, turning them over before answering. It was a quality she found she deeply respected in him. "My mother," he said. Then, "But I don't remember her, so it is a different kind of missing." Eleanor sat with that. She let it be what it was. Not small, not easy, not something that needed to be fixed. "I think that kind of missing is very real," she said. "Missing someone you did not have enough time with. Missing what there was not enough of." Theodore looked at the letter again. "Did you miss your mother?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She died when I was 12. I had had more time with her than you had with yours, which meant I had more specific things to miss." She considered. "You miss the shape of a thing you never fully had. I think that might be harder in some ways." Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the absolute gravity of 5-year-olds delivering important information, "Edmund says she smelled of roses." "That is a beautiful thing to know," Eleanor said. He nodded. Then he picked up his drawing things and began to draw, and the conversation was over, and it had been exactly the right length. Eleanor finished her letter. She sat in the morning schoolroom with Theodore drawing across the table from her, and she thought about Sebastian, about the way he had stood at the schoolroom door on Christmas Eve, and she had heard his footsteps going away down the corridor and then coming back. She had not turned around. She had not acknowledged it. She had let him have his private moment with his son's voice returning to the world, and she had not looked because it had not been hers to see. But she had known he was there, and she had known, somewhere, that he had come back, that he had returned to the doorway and stayed. The event in May was sudden and frightening and changed things. James fell from a horse on a Wednesday afternoon. He had been riding with the groom. He was a confident rider, perhaps too confident, and the groom had allowed it because James had a natural ability in the saddle that made it easy to forget he was 9 years old. The horse shied at a rabbit, and James came off badly, landing on his right arm. Eleanor heard the noise from the garden where she had been reading. She was at the stable in less than a minute, which told her something about how quickly she moved when something alarmed her, and she found James sitting on the ground with the groom crouching beside him, and an arm at an angle that made her stomach drop immediately. "I am all right," James said through his teeth. His face was the color of old paper. "I am completely all right." "You are not," Eleanor said, and she came down beside him on the ground without any of the hesitation she might have had in other circumstances, and she looked at the arm and she said, "Do not move it. Stay still. I am here." She turned to the groom. "Fetch Dr. Whitmore from the village. Tell him the bone needs setting. Go now, please." The groom went. Eleanor stayed beside James on the ground. She did not try to move him. She did not try to help him stand. She stayed exactly where she was, close enough that her shoulder was next to his, and she talked to him. Not about the arm, not about the pain, not about what was going to happen next, but about the ruined tower on the North Moor. She described it from memory, the details he had shown her in October, the scratch marks on the stones, the rooks in the high corner, the view to the valley on a clear day. She described it carefully and with complete attention, as though she were telling him a story that mattered, because she was. James listened. He kept his arm still. He breathed. When the groom returned with word that Dr. Whitmore was coming, "For Whit," James said, without preamble and without the defensive tone he usually used for everything. "Stay." "I am here," Eleanor said. "No," he swallowed. "When he sets it. Stay." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. Sebastian arrived at the stable before the doctor. Eleanor had not sent for him. Someone else had. He came through the stable door at a pace that barely looked controlled and stopped when he saw the scene. His son on the ground, Eleanor sitting beside him, both of them quiet and composed in a way that told him the situation was managed, even though it was clearly not good. He crouched on James's other side. He looked at the arm. He looked at James's face. "All right," he said. He did not say anything else. He simply put a hand on James's shoulder and kept it there. James leaned into it, just slightly, just for a moment. Then he straightened himself and said, "The horse shied at a rabbit. It was not my fault or the horse's fault. It was the rabbit." "Rabbits," Sebastian said with complete gravity, "have a great deal to answer for." James looked at him. Something moved in his face, unexpected, unlocked. He laughed. It was short and surprised, and clearly hurt him slightly because of the arm, but it was entirely genuine. Dr. Whitmore came. The arm was set, which was deeply unpleasant, and which James managed with white-faced determination, and no crying, though Eleanor could see from the tendons in his jaw how much it cost him. She held his left hand through the setting, at his request, and he gripped it hard enough that she knew she would feel it the following day, and she did not mention this or adjust her grip. Afterwards, James was settled in his room. Eleanor and Sebastian found themselves in the corridor outside his door, both of them still, both of them in the particular quiet that follows something that frightened you. "He is going to be fine," Eleanor said. "Yes," Sebastian said. He looked at the door. "Thank you, for what you did when it happened." "I did what anyone would do." He looked at her. "No," he said. "You did not do what anyone would do. You stayed on the ground beside him and you talked him through it. He told me." He paused. "He said you talked about the tower." Eleanor said nothing. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. The corridor was dim. The lamps turned low for the evening. They were standing close enough that she could see the detail in his expression, and what was in it was not the careful, composed face she usually saw, but something much more unguarded, the face of a man who has been frightened for his child, and is now close to the person who made that better, and does not know exactly what to do with the proximity. "Miss Voss," he said. "Eleanor," she said, before she could stop herself. Then, "I beg your pardon, that was—" "Eleanor," he said. She stopped. He said her name the way he said everything else, carefully, as though he had considered it. There was something in the way he said it that she had not expected and could not quite absorb, and she was a woman who was very good at absorbing things. They stood in the corridor. The house was quiet around them. From somewhere in the east wing came the distant sound of Theodore's voice, a low, tuneful murmur, which was something he did now in the evenings, a sort of gentle, private humming as he fell asleep. Sebastian reached across and took Eleanor's hand. He did it simply, without preamble, the way he did everything that mattered, without performance. He held it, and she let him, and they stood like that in the corridor outside James's room for a long time without speaking, while Theodore's voice came faintly down the hall, and the house settled around them in the dark. Eleanor held very still. She held her breath, then let it out slowly. She was careful, she reminded herself. She was careful, and she was sensible, and she was a professional in this household, and she was not going to make assumptions or build structures from a single gesture in a corridor at the end of a frightening day. She was, however, not removing her hand. She was aware of this. She was aware of it precisely and without excuses, and she decided, standing in the dark with Sebastian Harrow's hand around hers, that she was going to allow herself exactly this one unreasonable thing. It was, she thought, a very small, unreasonable thing. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. After the night in the corridor, nothing was said. This was not because Sebastian had retreated, when he had not, or not in the way Eleanor feared he might. He was precisely the same at breakfast the next morning. He asked about James. He asked about the lessons for the week. He poured his own coffee without ceremony and read his post and thanked Mrs. Pruitt for the toast. Nothing had changed and nothing was different, and Eleanor sat across the table and was almost entirely certain she had made a mistake. The hand in the corridor had been a moment of fear and relief and proximity, she told herself. People did things in corridors after their children had been hurt. It did not mean anything. She had been foolish to let it mean anything. She was a governess. He was a duke. She had a ruined reputation and no name and no fortune and no family of any consequence. And he had a title 300 years old and estates in 2 counties, and a seat in Parliament, and all of that was the actual reality, and the corridor had been a moment in the dark. She was very precise about this. She went over it several times a day, firmly and without sentiment, in the quiet hours when the boys were occupied and she had nothing to think about except the things she was trying not to think about. She did not lose her professional footing. She continued the lessons, she continued the reports, she continued reading in the evenings and walking in the mornings, and being present with 3 boys who were, undeniably and increasingly, becoming the central fact of her daily happiness. She loved them. She had stopped pretending she did not. She loved Edmund with his notebooks and his careful words, and James with his notebook that he tucked under his arm and his descriptions of rooks that were perfect, and Theodore with his silences that had become so full of meaning that she sometimes felt more understood by a 5-year-old who barely spoke than she had felt by anyone in years. She was not going to lose them over a corridor. She was not going to complicate her position here, in the only good place she had found in the wreckage of the past year, by making something out of nothing. The summer was warm, James's arm healed well, and by July he was back in the saddle, which he approached with a new carefulness that he had also declined to discuss. Edmund's applications to the school near York had been sent. There had been long conversations between Eleanor and Sebastian about the curriculum, about Edmund's specific strengths, about whether the environment would suit a boy who was more naturalist than classicist. These conversations happened in the study and lasted an hour, and were among the most intellectually engaged conversations Eleanor had had in years, because Sebastian thought about his son's education the way he thought about everything, with precision and genuine attention, and Eleanor had opinions that she had stopped softening into suggestions. She said what she thought. He considered it. Sometimes he agreed. Sometimes he offered a counter-argument that was worth taking seriously. Twice he changed her mind and once she changed his, and neither of them made anything of either occurrence, because that was simply what it was like to have a real conversation with a person who was genuinely thinking. It was in August that the trouble arrived. It arrived through Sebastian's sister Harriet, who had returned to Blackmere for the summer, and through a letter Harriet received from a mutual friend in Edinburgh, that mentioned, among other social news, that the Duke of Blackmere was being considered as a suitable match for a young noblewoman from Northumberland, named Miss Adelaide Crawford. Miss Crawford was 23, from an excellent family, had no scandal attached to her name, and was by all accounts a pleasant and intelligent woman. Eleanor heard about this from Mrs. Pruitt, which was not how she would have preferred to hear about it. Mrs. Pruitt told her with the delivery of someone who was imparting information they thought Eleanor deserved to have, rather than information they wanted to share. Mrs. Pruitt was not a gossip. She was a woman of considerable accuracy, and she told Eleanor the facts precisely. That she had overheard Lady Harriet mention the letter to the Duke in the hallway, and that the Duke's response had been brief and, as Mrs. Pruitt put it, not enthusiastic but not dismissive either, which was exactly the kind of qualified non-answer that left room for everything. Eleanor thanked her and went upstairs to the schoolroom. She sat at the table and she looked at the bookshelves she had rearranged in February. She looked at the penholder that now had all its nibs. She looked at the atlas with the corrected maps. She looked at Theodore's most recent drawing, a barn owl, copied from Edmund's notes and then elaborated upon with details of his own invention, pinned to the wall above the work table. Then she went to her room and she pulled her bag from under the bed. She did not do it with drama. She did it the way she did everything practical, systematically, without excess. She folded her better dress and put it in. She put in her books, her cameo brooch, her writing materials. She was doing this quietly and completely when she stopped and sat down on the edge of the bed. She sat for a long time. She thought about what she was doing and why she was doing it. She was a woman who was honest with herself, sometimes inconveniently so, and she was honest now. She was not packing because the position had become untenable. She was packing because she had allowed herself to feel something she had said she would not feel, and the news about Miss Crawford had landed like cold water on something she had not realized was warm. She was not angry at Sebastian. He had not done anything wrong. He had never said anything that could be construed as a promise of any kind. He had taken her hand in a corridor, once, that was all. That was, by any reasonable measure, nothing. It was not nothing, said the part of her that she could not silence. She sat with the bag half packed and she thought about the letters she would write to the boys. She had already composed Edmund's in her head. She knew what she would say to him. She knew the particular phrases that would land true and the ones that would miss. She thought about what she would write to James. She thought about what she would write to Theodore, who had begun to use words in the mornings and would use more as the weeks went on, and she thought about the fact that she would not be there for those words. She sat with this for a long time, on the edge of the bed, with the half-packed bag beside her. She did not write the letters. She did not know why she did not write them, whether it was cowardice or wisdom or some combination of both. She pushed the bag back under the bed and she put on her coat and she went downstairs and she walked out the back door onto the moor. She walked for 40 minutes. The summer moor was different from the winter moor, greener, more forgiving, the heather beginning to come in purple at the edges of the path. She walked without direction and without destination, and she thought about the truth, the actual truth, of the situation she was in. The truth was that she had fallen in love with Sebastian Harrow sometime between the library conversation about Flemish wool merchants and the night in the corridor, and she was not entirely certain of the exact moment, but she was entirely certain of the fact. She had known it for some time. She had been managing it with considerable discipline, and would have continued to manage it indefinitely, because she was a practical woman in an impossible situation, and practicality had always been her most reliable tool. The truth was also that she could not stay at Blackmere Hall indefinitely, not for the practical reasons she had been telling herself, not because of convention or propriety or the impossibility of her position, but because she had already passed the point at which leaving would be merely inconvenient. Leaving now would be deeply painful. Leaving in another year would be something worse. She turned back toward the house. She walked back across the moor in the late summer light and she thought, "It is better to go now. It is the sensible thing." She would finish the term. She would help Edmund make the transition to his school. She would make sure James's notebook habit was established, and Theodore's voice was finding its way into the world and the boys were settled. And then she would leave. And she would leave properly, with enough time for them to adjust. She would do it correctly. She would tell Sebastian she had decided to move on. She would be honest about her reasons in the way she was always honest. She would say something true without saying everything true. This was the plan. It was a good plan. It was the responsible and correct plan. She had been back in the house for 10 minutes when Sebastian appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom. She was hanging up her coat. She had not heard him come. She turned and he was there, and he looked. She did not know how to describe it precisely. He looked like a man who had been waiting and had reached the end of his patience with waiting. "I know about the bag," he said. Eleanor stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "Mrs. Pruitt told me." He paused. She felt it was relevant. Mrs. Pruitt. Eleanor thought briefly and vividly about the particular expression Mrs. Pruitt had worn when she had told Eleanor about the letter from Edinburgh. Not gossiping, giving information she thought Eleanor deserved to have, and apparently, simultaneously, giving Sebastian information she thought he deserved to have. "The bag is under my bed," Eleanor said carefully. "It is not packed." "Not any longer," he said. Mrs. Pruitt mentioned it was partially packed and then returned. Eleanor breathed. "I was thinking," she said. "About leaving." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. He was not in the careful, composed posture he used in the study. He was standing in the doorway of the schoolroom with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the expression of a man who had not yet decided exactly how to say what he had come to say. "I have had a great many people in my life," he said at last, "advising me on what I should do next. My sister, my solicitor, friends who remember what I used to be before Cecilia died and want me to return to it, as though 4 years can simply be stepped over." He paused. "There has been talk of Miss Crawford. I assume you have heard." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I have not met Miss Crawford," he said. "I have no particular feelings about Miss Crawford. I have not sought this out, and I have not refused it either, which I am aware is a form of passivity that I have been relying on too heavily in this area of my life." He looked at her. "I want to be clear that I am not going to marry someone because it is the thing people expect of me." Eleanor did not say anything. "I also want to be clear," he said, and he moved into the room properly, away from the doorway, closer to her, "about what I am going to do instead. Though I recognize I should have been clearer about this earlier and have not been, and I want to acknowledge that the unclearness has been a failure of courage on my part." Eleanor's hands were very still at her sides. The schoolroom was warm and bright, and the light through the windows was the long gold of summer afternoon. "I am not willing to let you leave this house," Sebastian said. "I am not willing to let you leave because my sons need you, and that is true. But it is not the most important thing I am saying. The most important thing I am saying is that I am not willing to let you leave because I am not willing to—" He stopped. He looked at her. He said what he meant, the way he always said what he meant, without performance. "I would like you to stay, not as someone employed in my household. I would like you to stay because the idea of you not being in this house, not being at breakfast, not being in the library at 9 o'clock with books about medieval wool merchants, Not being the person my sons come to first with all the things they do not know how to say. The idea of that is, it is not acceptable to me. The room was very quiet. Outside, the moor was green and gold in the long light. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, with the full force of her attention. The way she looked at things she was trying to understand completely. "You are afraid of this," she said. "Considerably," he said. "So am I," she said. "I know." He was very close now, close enough that she could see the detail in his expression, the careful steadiness, and the thing underneath it that was not steady at all. "I am asking you to be afraid of it here, with me, rather than somewhere else without me." Eleanor breathed. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. "I am a woman with no money, and no family, and a reputation that was destroyed by someone who did not like being told the truth," she said. "I have nothing to bring to this. You have brought everything to this," he said plainly. "You brought my son's voice back. You brought Edmund's notebooks out from under the bed. You showed James the difference between being managed and being known. You have been in this house for 9 months and it is more of a home than it has been in 4 years, and that is entirely your doing, and I will not hear you say you have brought nothing." Eleanor said nothing. The thing in her chest that she had been managing carefully and filing away on high shelves and refusing to look at directly had come down from the shelves entirely, and was simply present, large and warm and impossible to put back. "I am also aware," Sebastian said, "that I am asking something significant of you. I am asking you to attach yourself to a man who is not easy, and 3 boys who are considerably not easy, and a house in Yorkshire, and a life that will involve my solicitor expressing significant reservations and various people saying various things about the inappropriateness of the match." He paused. "I am asking you to do all of that on the basis of 9 months, which I recognize is not long." "It is long enough," Eleanor said, and she surprised herself with the certainty of it. She surprised herself, and she let herself be surprised, let herself feel the truth of it, without immediately organizing it into something manageable. 9 months in this house, 9 months of being present with these boys, 9 months of the library at 9 o'clock and the schoolroom in the mornings and James's notebook and Theodore's growing voice and Edmund's barn owl notebook spread on the table between them. 9 months of Sebastian Harrow's slow, precise, honest way of existing in the world. It was long enough to know. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, because once was not enough for a thing this size. The world did not approve, and then it did not matter. Sebastian's solicitor wrote a letter that was 3 pages long and politely frantic. 2 old family friends sent notes that managed in the careful way of people who considered themselves too civilized for direct disapproval, to express a great deal of it. Lady Harriet, when Sebastian told her, said absolutely nothing for a full 30 seconds, and then she said, "Good. It is about time," and went back to her embroidery without any further ceremony. The conversation with the boys happened on a Sunday morning, when the schoolroom was bright and the lessons were set aside, and Eleanor and Sebastian sat together in the chairs near the window and told them plainly. Edmund had already worked it out. Eleanor could see, from the careful neutrality he arranged on his face as Sebastian spoke, that he had reached his own conclusions some time ago, and was waiting to see whether the adults would confirm them. When Sebastian finished, Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at his father. Then he said, "Will Miss Voss still teach us?" "She will not be your governess," Sebastian said, "in the formal sense, but she is not going anywhere." Edmund gave a single thorough nod. Then he said, to Eleanor directly, "I finished the spring section of the barn owl records. I wanted you to check the notation." "After breakfast," Eleanor said. That was Edmund's acceptance. It was, in its way, complete. James sat through the conversation with his arms crossed and his legs extended, and an expression that was not quite readable, somewhere between the guardedness of the past and something newer and less defended. When Sebastian finished, James said, "What do we call her?" "Whatever you like," Sebastian said. James uncrossed his arms. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment. He looked at the floor. Then he said, in the tone of someone who had been thinking about this for some time and had arrived at a conclusion and was not going to be talked out of it, "Can we call her Mama?" The room was completely quiet. Sebastian was still. Eleanor's hands were in her lap and she could not see them because something had happened to her vision, a blurring around the edges that she was managing with extreme difficulty. She was a woman who did not cry in front of people. She was a woman who prided herself on her composure. She was, at this particular moment, in grave danger of failing both of these commitments entirely. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how, but it was. "If that is what you want." James nodded. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and pulled it on and said, "I am going outside," and left, which was James's way of handling emotion that was too big for the room. The door closed behind him. Through the window 30 seconds later, Eleanor saw him appear in the garden below and begin walking with his particular purposeful stride in the direction of the moor, and she knew he was going to the ruined tower, and she was glad he had it. Theodore was sitting in the big chair with his blanket. He had been listening to everything with his eyes moving back and forth between his father and Eleanor with an expression of total, concentrated attention. When the room was quiet, he looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then he said, with the deliberate clarity that had become the signature of his speech, "Are you going to stay forever?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I am going to stay forever." Theodore thought about this. Then he nodded, with the absolute satisfaction of someone who has received the precise information they required, and reached for his drawing things. The months between that morning and the wedding were not without difficulty. They were not supposed to be without difficulty. Difficult things are not made less real by the happiness around them. Sebastian's solicitor required 2 additional conversations and a considerable amount of reassurance about the legal particulars. There were people in Sebastian's social circle who did not come to the wedding, and this was noted and released. There were people who said things about Eleanor's history with Lady Ashworth and about the inadvisability of a duke marrying his governess, and these things were said and then became historical rather than immediate, the way things do when the people they are about refuse to be damaged by them. Lady Ashworth herself was not invited and did not comment publicly. What she thought, in private, about a pearl brooch that had presumably been found by now, Eleanor did not spend time imagining. Edmund went to the school near York in September. His departure from Blackmere was managed with characteristic composure. His trunk was packed with his usual precision, his notebooks were secured in a separate case, and he said goodbye to Eleanor with a handshake that was much less practiced than the one he had offered her on their first day, and therefore more real. At the door of the coach he turned back and said, "I will write," and Eleanor said, "I know you will," and he climbed in and the door closed. His first letter arrived 11 days later. It was 6 pages long and covered, in order, the school's natural history program, the quality of the library, his assessment of 3 fellow students he had met, a detailed account of a barn owl he had spotted from the dormitory window, and a final paragraph, in which he said that the food was adequate and he was well, and he hoped Theodore had continued his geography work. He said nothing explicitly personal, but the fact of the letter, 6 pages, 11 days, said everything. James wrote his first real piece for Eleanor in October. He brought it to her without ceremony, sliding it across the table in the schoolroom, as though it were homework, and then going to the window and looking at the moor with his back to her while she read it. It was about the ruined tower. It was 4 pages, handwritten in his cramped, urgent script, and it was, she read it twice to make sure she was not mistaken, extraordinary. Not in the way that meant it was technically correct or stylistically perfect, but in the way that meant it was utterly, completely itself. He described the tower from the inside on a winter morning, the light through the broken walls, the sound the wind made, the particular quality of stillness in a place that was full of old time. He described a boy sitting among the stones and the feeling of being small and large simultaneously, small in the face of everything the stones had seen, large in the face of the moor around him that went on without caring who was in it. He had not titled it. Eleanor read to the end and set it down and said, "James." He turned from the window. "This is excellent," she said. Not, "It is very good for a boy your age." Not, "This shows real promise." She said it the way she said things when she meant them completely. "This is genuinely excellent work. You should know that." James looked at her. The expression on his face was not quite embarrassment and not quite pride. It was the look of someone who has been seen in a way they both wanted and feared. "It is just the tower," he said. "It is not just the tower," Eleanor said. "It is what the tower is for you, and that is worth writing." He picked the pages up and held them. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I am going to write about her sometime. My mother." He did not look at Eleanor. "Not now, but sometime." "Whenever you are ready," Eleanor said. He left with the pages under his arm, which was where they always went. Theodore began speaking in full sentences by November. Not constantly, not volubly. He was not and never would be a child who used words easily or often, but with a regularity and a clarity that filled the house in a different way than silence did. He said what he thought, which was always more than people expected. He said it when he felt it, which was not always at convenient moments. He said it plainly, without the social management that most people applied to their speech, and the effect was that when Theodore Harrow spoke, people listened, because there was nothing in his words that was not meant. He was 6 by the time of the wedding. He attended it seriously, in a new suit he had been deeply interested in and had inspected from multiple angles, and he stood beside James in the small Yorkshire church that had been the Harrow family church for 200 years, and he held himself very still through the ceremony, with the concentrated solemnity of someone who understood that important things deserved to be witnessed properly. Afterwards, in the churchyard, while Sebastian spoke to the vicar, and Harriet organized the gathering with the cheerful efficiency that was her gift to the world, Eleanor stood near the gate in the pale winter sunlight in the dress she had been lent, white wool, high-necked, with a narrow band of lace at the collar that had belonged to Sebastian's grandmother, and which Harriet had produced from a cedar chest with the air of someone who had been waiting to produce it for some time. She looked out over the churchyard. The grass was winter pale, and the sky was clear, and the moors were visible in the distance, brown and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small human events taking place beneath them. She thought about November of last year, standing in the rain on the pavement outside Lady Ashworth's house with her bag over one arm. She thought about the employment agencies and the boarding house and Mrs. Quill and the bread she had made last 4 days. She thought about collapsing on a front step and waking up on a green sofa, and the soup that had been warm and the shoes drying by the fire. She thought about 3 boys in the first evening with them, and all the evenings after, and the notebooks and the tower on the moor, and the corridor, and the library at 9 o'clock, and the piano on Christmas Eve, when a 5-year-old had said his first word into the warm air of the room, and she had kept playing so the moment would not break. She felt a small hand take hold of her fingers. She looked down. Theodore was standing beside her, hand in hers, looking out at the same view she had been looking at. He was in his serious churchyard mode, thoughtful and quiet. "Are you happy?" he asked. He said it the way he asked all his questions, directly, without preamble, wanting to know. "Yes," Eleanor said. She thought about the word and what it meant. She thought about whether it was precise enough for what she felt, and then she thought that precision was Sebastian's habit and not always hers, and that sometimes yes was simply what needed to be said. "Yes, Theodore, I am very happy." He squeezed her fingers once, then he said, in the conversational tone of someone making an observation, "You look like someone who belongs here." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the churchyard, and the pale winter sky, and the moors in the distance. She looked at Sebastian across the grass, talking to the vicar with one hand in his coat pocket, and he glanced up as though he had felt her attention, and their eyes met across the cold air, and something in his face moved in the way she had come to know, the almost smile, the warmth in the dark eyes, the man behind the careful composure who was present and real and entirely hers. "I do," she said, to Theodore. She said it with the full and quiet certainty of someone who has found, after a great deal of difficulty and rain and bread made to last 4 days, exactly where they are supposed to be. She held Theodore's hand. Across the grass, Sebastian began to walk toward them. Behind him, James was arguing with Harriet about something with his usual animated energy, and Harriet was laughing, and the whole scene was warm and ordinary, and particular to these exact people in this exact place. And Eleanor looked at all of it and let it be real. She had come here because she had nothing left. She had stayed because she had found something she had not known to hope for. She had built, in a house on the Yorkshire moors, in the company of 3 boys who needed her, and a man who had been very still for a very long time, a life that was entirely and specifically her own. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the life she would have constructed from the outside, with sensible choices and reasonable expectations, and no rain-soaked collapses on strangers' front steps. It was something harder and stranger and more exact than any of that, made from difficult things and unexpected kindness, and the particular alchemy of being genuinely, wholly present in a place that needed exactly what she had. Sebastian reached them. He stood beside her in the pale light, close enough that his shoulder touched hers. He looked at Theodore, who was still holding Eleanor's hand, and looking out at the moor with thoughtful eyes. "What are you looking at?" Sebastian asked his son. Theodore considered this. "Everything," he said. Sebastian looked at Eleanor. The almost smile was there, and she felt it the way she had come to feel everything about this man, specifically, exactly, as a thing that was entirely for her. She smiled back, without managing it, without performing it, simply and completely. It was cold, and the wind was off the moor, and the churchyard grass was winter pale around them, and Eleanor Voss, who had stood in the rain with nothing, and been called a thief, and eaten bread made to last 4 days, and held herself together by sheer stubbornness across 15 terrible days, was, in the quiet and particular and irreplaceable way of people who have found the thing they were made for, exactly where she belonged. She held her husband's hand. She held her son's hand. She looked at the moor. The wind moved across it in its old, untroubled way, caring for none of them and all of them equally, the way the best things do.